Welcome to Intro to Ember JS. So let's start with a little bit of history. So in the history of web apps, probably the most momentous occurrence was about 2001 or so, creation of Gmail. Gmail was like really the first thing that I would say like really classified as a web app, where it felt like an application. It was just running in your browser. It's wild, man. All that stuff was just vanilla JavaScript. It was really like pushing JavaScript into places that it was not intended to go. And like in a lot of ways, the language started trying to keep up with how that was being used. So we started getting easier ways to handle a lot of those things. A big part of that was Jquery. A lot of people thought, and some of them still think, that the purpose of Jquery was to like add new features into JavaScript that it was missing. It did a little bit of that, but that really wasn't it at all. Around this time, it turns out that like browser standardization was not nearly what it is now. And so you'd have to have like an Internet Explorer version of your app and a Mozilla version of your app. And like Google has this new browser now that people are trying to figure out, and Safari. And the differences between these browsers were fairly substantial. The purpose of Jquery was that we could write our code once, and then Jquery would figure out what the differences between the browsers needed to be. But it also like made it a lot easier to do things like make network requests. Making a raw XHR request in JavaScript is fucking gnarly. And in an era before fetch, $Ajax was a pretty big improvement. So people start making app-like things with Jquery. And it's okay. Some of that stuff is still out there. A lot of that stuff is still out there. If you go work for like a bank or something like that, they probably have Jquery somewhere out there. Jquery died, and it didn't die because it sucked. It died like the best hero's death a library can die. It won. It's just part of the language now. A lot of the like query selector that didn't exist before Jquery and was largely inspired by Jquery. Fetch was inspired by Ajax. There was like a lot of cool things in Jquery that all just sort of became part of the language, so we didn't need a separate library for it. So Jquery is still like mainly about making just mod 2, mod 3 style browser apps. You could do some single page application-y kinds of things with it, but it was still kind of rough. So enter Backbone. Backbone is like, I would describe that as the first SPA framework. So not a whole lot of the ideas from Backbone have survived through like all this evolution, but that was like the framework to beat for a while. It's like, oh man, Backbone is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. How is anybody going to top that? Well, turns out a shit ton of people tried. Knockout was pretty big at the time. Meteor was pretty big at the time. Ember came out then. And AngularJS. Google got in on the game. Who on earth is going to keep up with Google on this? So like this was the competitive landscape in like a post-Backbone world. And so whenever you hear like an old timer talk about how like, oh man, drinking game, every time someone says a word, find out if it's a JavaScript framework. A lot of that came from this era because there was like a new one every week.
What was the decade?
Like, what was that?
What was the decade?
This was not that long ago. This was 6 years ago, probably. So yeah, if I'm putting dates on these, I believe Gmail was like 2001, 2002, 2003, somewhere in there. 2002. JQ was probably 2005. Backbone was probably, I'll say like early teens. Like this might be 2012 or so. And all of this was like 2015. Dates are probably a little bit off, but like this general flow feels about right to me. Cool. So at the time, the like ubiquitousness that React has now, like that's what Angular was. Everyone was like, man, why would you ever learn anything but Angular? And the big catalyst there was React. So Facebook comes out with React, which had one major paradigm shift, two, but one of them really stuck. The way that all of these, including Backbone, worked was with a thing called two-way binding. Like you can have code that updates something on the page. You have something on the page that updates the code. So these things, actually, a better way to draw that would be, it's probably a better way to draw one-way binding. These things were all two-way binding. The big thing React introduced was one-way binding. All the data flow goes one direction. And it turns out that's an order of magnitude more efficient than two-way binding was. So if you've done the React stuff, or we have to like do the thing we do with controlled forms, that was a game changer. That idea that it's kind of inconvenient to write, but doing that stuff in a circle, way more computationally effective. So Angular goes, cool, we actually want to borrow some of those ideas. And so they came out with Angular. Completely different framework. It's not Angular JS 2, even though they used that numbering scheme. It was like ground up completely different. None of the apps were compatible. There was no upgrade path from one to the other, which effectively burned all of the Angular community's goodwill. Because if you dumped a lot of money into training up your team on Angular JS, oops, sorry, rewrite your app, I guess. So Angular's still in play today, but pretty much only at enormo companies. Ember survives too. How Ember handled the one-way data binding thing was they just changed their internals. No one's external code, like the actual stuff that you wrote, had to change. It's pretty cool. Meteor died. It turned into another framework that was also not popular. Knockout died. AngularJS died. So for a while, this was the landscape. We had React, Angular, Ember. So I was very active in the Ember community at the time. I ran the Ember meetup in Denver. I went to EmberConf in Portland every year. And like people kept saying like, oh, Ember's losing. It was in third place in this era. But at EmberConf one year, they said something really telling, which was like, yeah, it's not winning. Who gives a shit? Do you really want to win? Do you know what winning looks like? Winning means you become a default. That means you get used by default developers who work for default companies. Is that what you want in your community? And it's not an elitism thing. It's all the Ember developers, then and now, intentionally chose this framework and its approach to it. You guys didn't choose to learn React. We made you learn React. If someone's using Ember, they picked that. That's a powerful thing. And that stuck with me. So in this next era, enter Vue. And then enter Svelte. So then the competitive landscape becomes React, Vue, and Svelte. Knockout, Meteor, AngularJS, these don't have active development anymore. They're like donezo. Nobody's doing projects in those. Ember, however, little framework that could. That like new LinkedIn design, Ember app. LinkedIn is all Ember. So it's still out there. It's still under active development. It's still getting features that React won't have for 5 fucking years. I'm not even joking. But it is not a contender. Like it was on the like avoid list in the Stack Overflow survey for this year, but not for any good reason. It's not slow. It's actually crazy fast. It's not inefficient to develop on. It's way faster to develop on than any of these other tools. But the reason why this is still the most overlooked framework is that it is hard as fuck to learn. It's not JavaScript. React, like 80% of React is technically just JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, you're a pretty good way toward learning React. Now the problem, and Svelte shares this a little bit also, and Vue to some extent as well, is that React takes no opinions on the hardest things in app development. Has no opinion about routing, has no opinion about state management, has no opinion about deployment, about caching, about how builds are done. It's a tiny little single purpose library, which is cool until, as Jesse Pope is telling me today, like you have something like routing that's very difficult to get right. Neat. There's also like only one right way to do it. And so now you're just crossing your fingers that whoever architected your app got that piece right. And if they don't, boy howdy, are you going to have a real rough time developing in this app. Ember has had the same router for a very long time. They actually gave it to Angular too. Angular has the same router. So let's like a quick comparison of what these things offer, because they're very similar. These are component libraries. That have optional routing, state management, deployment stuff, and like various other things. They gave it like, and I think React has had like 6 popular routers since it came out. I've seen 3 popular React state management tools and another one on the way that's going to replace all of them. Webpack has been the dominant way to build React apps. Yeah, until Rome takes over, because everybody's super pumped about Rome now. So we have churn, and you as a developer have to figure out how you want to wire all this stuff together and how you want it to work. Vue is a little different in this regard. Vue has official libraries that are like maintained by the core team for all of these things, but you don't have to use them, and they don't tell you how they should be structured. Another thing that I think is baffling about all of these is their CLI tooling. So create React app's a good example, where you go, cool, create React app, and that's it. That's all you ever do on the command line. Vue, a little more interactive. When you do Vue create, you get like an interactive menu for like how you want your app to be structured. But again, once you've done that, there's not a whole lot else to do on the CLI. Ember, way different. We have integrated CLI. We have integrated testing. We have integrated routing. We have integrated state management. So like those of you who've done stuff in Express, you think about the difference between connects and objection versus active record, and you get a pretty good idea of what I mean by integrated. Active record, it's all just kind of built into it, man. It's all just sort of works. As long as you're following the conventions, you get everything you want. Ember is Rails for the front end. And like, I mean that in more way than one. Not only is it also an opinionated framework, but it is like literally built by the same people. The original Ember folks were all ex-Rails core team folks. So a lot of the philosophy sort of carries over. So that's the context on what this is, how we got there, where it sits relative to the rest of the tools. I want to pause there. Ask me some questions. I was here for a lot of this.
What were those Ember meetups like?
Awesome. They were so much fun. I'd say like in its peak, we could probably get 40 or 50 people at those. React meetup on the other hand was 10 people. And like Ember, like one of the taglines for Ember is like, come for the framework, stay for the community. It's very true. You get to know the rest of the Ember developers in the world, like from the forums, from the Slack, from the conference, from talks. I've never seen something like that before or since. Like how close you feel to developers that you've never met, never written a line of code with, and then you get together once a year for a week in Portland and like hang out with them. It's pretty cool.
One of my questions is, so being such an opinionated framework, it seems like, well, the advantage is you don't create things the wrong way and you can create things fast and like do agile web development. But then I'm wondering, do you foresee any losses in the types of things you could do, given that like maybe some specific custom functionality that you need for a website that's not very common in websites? Is that something you experience in Ember? Like,
not really. So like that's like a common criticism. 9 times out of 10, when somebody wants to do that, it's because they're thinking of their problem wrong. Like a common refrain in the Ember world is don't fight the framework. If you're fighting the framework, you're probably thinking about your problem wrong. There are some things though, like a good example would be GraphQL. Like a lot of the Ember integrated state management stuff is predicated on RESTful APIs. Well, GraphQL is not a RESTful API. All of the opinions in Ember are overridable, and a lot of them aren't even that hard to override. And so you can totally integrate GraphQL without changing a single line of application code. And I think that's pretty cool.
but do you wind up with an app that's as robust as, like, let's say you were to have a React app that had maybe some package that allows you to work with GraphQL?
Oh yeah, totally. And then like, but here's the thing, since it's such a heavy community driven framework, the first person who solves that problem just publishes their solution, then everybody uses that and improves on that.
So you found that the community is actually in a lot of ways just better for Ember, even though like the community is a lot larger for like React.
Well, like, let's be specific about the word community. React has a lot of developers. I haven't observed much of a community at all. There's like a cult of personality around Dan Abramov, but like, that's not a community. He's an ex-Ember guy, Ryan Florence. He's another one that has a little bit of cult of personality around him, but I don't see like React developers who know the other React developers very much. They know a couple celebrities. So I would say that like, yeah, Ember's community is more existent and certainly stronger than React's.
Are there things like huge component libraries for Ember and stuff like that, all that exists?
Absolutely.
Nice.
And things like suspense that like React folk have been dying for like a year and aren't getting anytime soon. That's been in Ember for 5 years. Same thing with like the server-side rendering stuff they got out of Next. Ember had that 5 years ago. Like a lot of this stuff, like due in part to just how long it's been around and how consistent that community contribution has been. Like, Ember's got robust solutions to lots of shit. Other questions about history of front-end frameworks? Cool. So we're going to get a little bit hands dirty. So one of the things I want you to do is npm install -g ember-cli. npm install -g ember-cli. It's enormous. So while that's pulling down, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how all Ember apps are structured. Because it's a lot like Rails. There are, like, I've never seen two React apps that look the same. There are no two Ember apps that look different. They're all structured very similarly.
Sorry, Kyle, can you show that command line code one more time?
Yep. npm install -g ember-cli. So the structure of an Ember app an HTTP request comes in and goes to a router. The router's job, and the router works very similar to the Rails router. Router's job is to figure out which route should handle the request. The route's job is to interact with state. So this will look up any models that we need. And these models work a lot like they did in Active Record. A model gets serialized, just like in Rails. And then a model goes to an adapter. The job of an adapter is to figure out what URL the request should go to. You'll notice in an Ember app, we don't write fetch requests. We can, we super don't need to. So this is going to go to your API. API comes back, gets deserialized, hydrates the model, comes back to the route. So I say, give me all the dogs. And it goes, cool, what's a dog? All right, cool. I'm going to serialize this request. I'm going to make the request to your API. The data comes back. I deserialize it. I give you instances of dog objects, and those are ready in the route. So now that all that's happened, this route makes that available on a controller. The route also renders a template that can call actions and read data from the controller. And then in this template, it's just components all the way down. And those work the same way they do in React. So another apt comparison would be React does this. Ember does all of this. Big picture questions about this. It's not going to make sense until like you've worked with it for a while. But any questions about why any of these things exist?
How do you access two routes at the same time?
So very similar to how you do in Vue or Angular, your templates can nest inside of each other, and so your routes can too. So you can have a route within a route within a route, which ultimately means a template within a template within a template.
They have to correspond one-to-one.
Yep, always do.
Do you pre-populate your data a lot of the time in an Ember app and then just
You can.
feed it to the component when it needs it or when it requests it?
And alley-oop. Yep, let's take a look at it. So to make a new Ember app, do Ember new, we'll call this dogs app. Ember new dogs dash app. Oop. Ember new dogs dash app. All right, throws all this stuff in here. Hey, this looks an awful lot like Rails. It made a bajillion and one files for us. Structured them a particular way, getting all our dependencies installed.
I think you forgot dash dash API. Just kidding.
Do you know flags that you can add to this?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any like worth noting, like Ember new, whatever? Gotcha.
So it's a little bit less important to do that when you're making the app because we get so many of these things that are interactive. Like, check this out. Ember has an entire like independent plugin ecosystem that you can access through Ember add-on. So you can like Ember add-on install maps, and you'll get like a mapping plugin. So you can do something like that, and it'll show how big your generated files are. This does your production build. Generate and destroy work a lot like they do in Rails. You can make components, you can make routes, you can make controllers, you can make templates, you can do all that stuff with the generate command, and you can undo those with destroy. And it is like a different version of new that just does it in the folder you're already in.
Nice.
So these are some of the flags for making a new app. Like, for example, Bower. Bower is like was a predecessor to NPM. Or no, it's concurrent to NPM. It was Twitter's version of NPM. And like it's still a part of Ember, but won't be for much longer. So if you want to just say fuck it, you can skip it. So like those are some of the options. Use Yarn instead of NPM.
Nice.
Cool. Let's go into our dogs app. So to run an Ember app, much like we do on Rails, Ember S or Ember serve. So if we do that, we're serving up our app on localhost 4200. Hey, cool. We see our splash screen. Fun fact, this little splash screen right here was made by David Baker, who was an Ember core team member that was based out of Denver and currently runs the meetup, I believe.
What does
right,
broccoli
so-
roll up mean?
What was that?
Broccoli roll up.
Broccoli is an alternative to Webpack. And so, and rolling up is part of its process of doing all the things that Webpack and build tools like that do. Okay, so if we go to app templates application.hbs. This is the thing we're seeing on the screen. So HBS is handlebars. It's a templating syntax. It's like JSX, except it's a little bit easier to read. So welcome page is the name of the component. You notice we didn't need to import it. We didn't need to do anything special. As long as it follows conventions, Ember will find it. So that one in particular, it might be, I think it's in the framework somewhere. Yeah, that makes sense. So if I want to get rid of it, bye. And I can say something. I'm going to keep that outlet in there. You can put whatever you want in there, and it shows up. I want you to take a second and get this far. All right, so hopefully you got something showing up on your page now. Questions so far?
So you said that the templating language for, like, HBS stands for handlebars, right? Is that an Ember specific thing, or is that a templating language pulled from somewhere else that Ember utilizes?
Porque no los dos. It's made by Yehuda Katz, who is the Ember guy, but it's independent from Ember. For example, I use it on my personal site.
And that's handlebars, right?
Yep. So, for example, on kylecobley.com, which is not an Ember app, I have all these like talk pages. They're all structured the same way, but they are all actually independent HTML pages. So I have a template for those that I wrote in handlebars that looks like this. Similar kind of idea to JSX, except you get a lot more stuff for free. Like conditionals and loops. Weird. Other questions so far?
What's the outlet thing on that page?
The outlet. So I mentioned that, like, if we're doing nested routes, we're just rendering templates inside of templates inside of templates, routes inside of routes inside of routes. So in practice, what that looks like is at the top level, you always have like application. Application's a magic word. Application means top level. But it has this outlet in it that any nested template would render inside. And then that one can also have its own outlet that any nested thing would render inside.
Oh, so it's almost kind of like you have HTML pages nested inside of HTML pages.
That is exactly how you should think of it. An outlet just specifies where it goes.
Can you go a little bit more over the syntax of what this says, like outlet? What outlet is it referencing? It sounds like you could have different ones.
It's saying if you try to render anything inside of me, that will get swapped out for that.
Okay. So you're saying the thing rendered inside will get swapped out for outlet. I'm not sure I understand what you mean there.
Like the
Right.
double curlies are indicating that.
The double curlies are like, they work the same way that single curlies do in JSX. We're like, all right, if I'm doing something JavaScripty or Embery or otherwise just not HTML, it needs to be wrapped in curlies. They're mustaches or handlebars. Get it?
I think I have seen that with like Python code before nested inside of HTML.
Yeah.
So if you were building out a full-scale app, would that still say outlet, or would it say like what would be the next thing under it that it would say? Like, would you be nesting the smaller HTML that you're referencing there, like the?
So all of this is being handled by the router. The router says, all right, application.hbs, that's on every single page.
Okay.
Anything that's any other route that I want to render renders inside of that. Where does it render? Renders inside of the outlet. Those things can have outlets.
So I'm kind of like restructuring the way I'm thinking about this now, because like now it almost makes me think more of like I'm thinking of like application.hbs as like a like main, like a big div container, and now you can put other divs and sections and images inside of it.
Maybe. You could, but like as an example, this might be on every page and it might have like little navigation items or something like that. This one might be /users. This one might be /users/some ID. This is on
Sometimes
every
they
page.
nudge each other out of the way.
What do you mean?
I mean, like you're not going to display users and users ID necessarily. Maybe
Like you would if you're structuring it this way. So like if you're on the user's path, anything that's under that would have these. And so if I go to users 35, I see everything that's on this and everything that's on this and everything that's specific to like user show pages. Now to your point, I don't have to do it that way. I don't have to nest those. I could have application and /users and /user/ID not nest. That's a choice I get to make too. But if I wanted something to be present on every single user show page, I could do it this way. And this is the idea of a template inside of a template inside of a test template.
And you're saying that the handlebars outlet is referencing a template or a route?
No, the outlet is where this box goes.
Oh, so you're saying this box like goes on application.
Okay. Okay, so let's say we have, this is the thing that we're eventually going to have. So in practice, like those are going to be 3 different files. This one is going to look like that. This one is going to look like that.
Oh.
And then this one is going to look like that.
So outlet is kind of just Ember's way of telling you what the outermost elements of this file are.
It's saying when you render something inside of me, this is where it's going to go.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Sorry that I had to like ask 10 questions to get there.
Cool. Other big picture questions about why this is showing up on the page? Cool. Let's make a route. So we're going to say Ember G route index. So this is, if we're not in a more specific route, if I'm not at /dogs, this is the thing that shows up inside of that outlet. If I'm at /dogs, the dogs template shows up inside of that outlet. If I haven't picked anything, like I'm in the root right now, that's an index. So these are the files that it made. I can go over to this template that it made. And I'm just going to say, and there it is. This is showing up inside of that outlet. If I flip the order of them, puts it on top. Punches a hole through the template and renders another template inside of it. If, say I had a dogs page, Ember G route dogs. I can go over to that dogs template that it made me. And now I go to /dogs. I did not like that I didn't close that p tag. So now if I go to that dogs page, the index becomes the dogs page. Now pause for a sec. Note that I didn't touch the router. I didn't touch a controller. I didn't have to do anything with the route files. If I'm just following conventions, everything is wired up for me already. That's like a hint of what this like Ember paradigm is all about.
Can you show again, because I missed it, how you switched the order between the two?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just moved it.
Oh, okay. The application.
Yeah, wherever the outlet is. Like effectively what I'm doing on this dogs page is taking this and just copy paste removing outlet and putting whatever the nested template was in. So I want to link to that page. Always want to be able to get to the index, always want to be able to get to the dog page. So maybe I make a nav bar. So the way we do links, well, this is how we did it 3 years ago, which is the last time I made an Ember app. So we're gonna find out together whether or not this still works. Link to dogs. Like that. Link to index. Home. Ah, cool. Looking good so far. Can I go home? I'm on the index. I'm on the dogs page. That's routing. Also, note that like the URL updates, that's like an example of something that drives me batshit crazy about React, is that getting the URL to work, that's like a library, that's a plugin. We have to like set that up right. So as a result, almost no React apps like do their URLs correctly, which means your browser can't cache it well, which means you can't bookmark it, which means you can't send someone a link to something. Annoying. All the like UX niceties of this, we just get out of the box. Cool. So that is your like rough and tumble intro to Ember. I want to show you something that gives you an idea of what this client-side state management could look like, because it's badass. I think it's the thing I miss the most from writing Ember apps a lot. So I mentioned that, like on this dogs page, for instance, like presumably I want some data to work with there. So if I go to the dogs route that got auto-generated when I ran that CLI command, if I have a model hook in here, whatever I return from this model hook is going to be available on that template. Strictly speaking, it was sent to the controller, which was bound to the template, but don't worry about it. So if I return like a list of dogs, that's going to be available in that dogs template. So what it will look like is, oh man, you don't need, I don't need to map over something to loop something? Huh? Something like that. Hey, there they are. Cool. So let's say that that comes from an API, and like, presumably it would, right? So to integrate that with an API, watch how many fetch requests I don't write. Ember G model dog. Done. And that model file, this works a lot like models in Rails did. I'm gonna pull in adder. And this is new to Ember from like since my era. Actually, I need to look up the syntax on this. Ember data adder.
Just the word.
Yeah, cool. So these are called annotations. They work the, these are from Java, actually. They're actually pretty cool, but they let us like, and this is like a common complaint about Ember, it's not JavaScript, it's Ember. But if you can like let go of your tears for that, it ends up working out pretty great. All right, so I'll say adder name. Oops. Is it really? No, not a string. Cool. All right, so I do that. This is the only attribute that's on this model. Then I'm going to make an adapter. Ember G adapter application. Just like the template, application is every single model should try to connect to an API this way. And so what we do, we'll go to that and we'll say that the host name, Ember, just host. Thank you. Is localhost 4000. That should be cool. And you get all kinds of like adapters and stuff out of the box. We're going to use the REST adapter. Cool. Awesome. Now let's make like some dopey little fucking Express server. Actually, I might have one already. LS. Nope. All right, fuck it. So I'll say, oh, I remember Ember server. Okay, so I have this little dog server here. I can just hard code some things in here. Cool, and then I just fire that back. Neat. As simple as an Express server as you can reasonably do. So I'm going to node index.js that. That's running on port 4000. If I go over to localhost 4000/dogs, there's my dogs. Watch this. So over here, if I go back to that route that I had, instead of hard coding this thing in here, I do return this.store.findAll dog. That's coming from my server. No fetch request needed. It figured out that like the URL was supposed to be /dogs. It did all that stuff. What's more, if I try like, if I made show pages for these and I'm clicking around there, it doesn't make the network request again. I was like, I just did that. You have those in memory already. You want dog 2? I have dog 2. Here you go. That's so cool. So what I find is that when I'm making Ember apps, all of the code that I write is specific to my problem. I never end up writing any code that's boilerplate, generic. You'd have to do with any Ember app. The only stuff you write is specific to your problem. And I think that's pretty cool. Cool, that's Ember. Ask me some questions.
So is that why at the beginning you said that it's hard to learn because there's not a lot of boilerplate stuff? You're always kind of trying to figure out exactly what kind of code you need to solve what kind of problem?
Yes. You need to have a pretty decent grasp of this entire mental model before you can get much of anything done. That's a mountain to climb. But if you think of the learning curve as like a cliff, it is a real nice slide back down once you get up to the top. You can just dream apps and just shit them out. They fly. It's really, really nice. But it is a massive time investment up front to like wrap your head around this idea. React? Nope. Just write your whole app inside of your app.js file. And so much of it leverages the JavaScript you already know that it's a lot faster to learn. But ultimately, you end up recreating this entire thing. Or like what I think is the right way to make Vue apps is real damn similar. I was showing this to someone yesterday. The app architecture with Vue. Yeah. So I think the correct way to architect basically every Ember or Vue app. Hey, what do you know? It's a router. We don't have routes, but views end up being basically the same thing. It goes to a view. Those render components. They interact with the store. that has a model, that has an adapter, that has a serializer. You end up recreating all this shit anyway, except you're probably going to get it wrong, especially if you're new. And you have to like write all this out by hand. It's annoying. Other questions?
So the data from your route is accessed with @model.
Yep.
What about the data from the nested routes? How would
So
you act?
you can't get the data from your children's nested routes, but
Right.
they can get the data from all of their parents.
Right. So how would you access that? It's not model. It's not being passed down the same way as components.
This has changed since my day. So let's see, Ember routes. Let's see, Ember 3 routes access parent route models. Those are from 2017, but I'll bet it's the same idea. No. Model 4, yeah, that's it. Model 4 was how you did it back in my day. And where this is the name of the route. So like if I have a dogs route and a dog route, then in my dog route, I could go this dot model for dogs and get whatever came out of that too.
And that works only with the parents.
Yeah, so like, because the other ones, they go sequentially. So when the parent route hooks are firing, the children haven't rendered yet. And then anything that's not in your like immediate hierarchy didn't render, so they don't have models.
So also with the models, they have, very similar to Rails, they have extensive relationships.
Can.
Yeah, is it, do you have to use both of them or one versus the other?
So if you're like working with relationships is another thing that's awesome about Ember data, because like I'm iterating over the dogs in this template. This could just as easily be like, so like, or I guess it'd probably be more like, and then you can get your list of owners there. And likewise, it'll also figure out, based on how you structured those models, what fetch requests it needs to make to get that data. That's cool. And then if I switch from a REST API to JSON API, if I switch to HAL 9000, if I switch to GraphQL, the advantage of having this entire like long ass chain be split off from the entire application is the application doesn't give a shit. It cares what comes out of the model hook. If it comes out of the model hook structured the same way, whatever happened in between, why should your app code care about any of that? That's powerful. It also lets you do things like, all right, let me take the server out of the equation. Let me just hard code the response to the model.
So I've got like my application handlebar and my index handlebar like linked, like the outlet in the application is picking up the index. How would I link like the outlet in the index to like the dogs handlebar? I'm just trying to understand how to like specific outlets
You wouldn't, not with index. Like an index is specifically, you didn't pick something. As soon as you pick something, you're not in an index anymore. So like dogs is taking the place of index. They sit right next to each other.
Gotcha. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's going to take a while to wrap my head around this structure.
Oh yeah, this is heavy. This is lots. Other questions before I hop over to the live coding thing?
Are you sure this isn't Rails? Like those templates look a lot like ERB.
Right? The syntax is 100 times better than the ERB, but inspired by.
Seems like the one thing that the framework is not opinionated about is where certain things happen. So like it said, in all the reading I've done, it said you can interact with the store in the routes, in the components, in the controllers. And so what I found is that it generates a controller for you automatically when the model hook runs. So what do controllers do? Like, what are they used for if they're not necessary?
That's a complicated question. So they are necessary for one thing. This has been the case for years, for binding to query params. If like you want your query params, like imagine something where like you're hovering over something on a map and you want the lat longitude in your URL to update automatically, you need controllers. The only way you can do that in Ember. Failing that, you probably shouldn't be using controllers. A component is a controller plus a view. Views got ripped out of Ember entirely. Controllers are still hanging around, but there's nothing outside of that you can't do with a component, so you probably just should. And yes, you're right. You can do a lot of those store interactions from anywhere. You should not. My rule for that is that the only thing that should interact directly with the store is a route. And so if that means you need to bubble up events until they get to the necessary route, that's what I would do.
So if you're posting something, you want that happening in the route too?
Correct. So if I have some nested form that created a thing, I pass that through events up and up and up and up, and eventually it hits the route. And once it hits that, you might even also want to bubble that up a couple times to the route hierarchy. But ultimately, that's where you're like, this.store.create will end up going.
So the only thing you're really doing in the component.js file is state management.
Correct. Or like, yeah, so that, or the things that trigger those actions up to the hierarchy. Ember, handlebars templates are stateless. You can't just do arbitrary JavaScript logic inside of a handlebars template like you can in Vue or React. So if you have something that's calculated like that, that needs to be on the component.
So let's see this. How do I say this? So when you're using state in React, you can initialize things as an empty object or an empty array. But you can't do that in Ember because an empty array is falsy. And
no, empty array is truthy. It's an object, I promise you.
Empty array?
Yep.
I think I actually tested this for a Code Wars a few days ago. Yeah.
Empty array.
Okay. So when I'm initializing something, to take in an input, but I'm doing it as a select. So the input, obviously, you initialize as an empty string, but the select.
Well, selects have options.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
There's a lot of those things that you just don't need to manage by hand because the state management is so much more robust. You only have to manage those things in Vue and React because they don't do that much for you. So you need to be very explicit about what your initial state is. You don't have to worry about that in Ember.
Kyle, that experiment that you just did on the browser showed that the empty array equals true was false. Wouldn't that make it falsy?
Oh, shoot. You're right. So we do, let's see. If oops. Come on, man. There we go. If that console log and it printed hi because it's truthy.
Oh.
Versus like if I did.
So equals is not a good test to see whether or not it's truthy or falsy.
Oh, not in JavaScript.
Weird.
Yeah.
You gotta like if it, or you gotta do like a dot length or something.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah, dot
this
length is
is
the like preferred way to do that, or is empty from Lodash.
Okay. What is your typical way that you would? This is not really an Ember question at all, but what is the typical way that you would check to see if a key is in a object? Because I've seen a few different ways, and I know Vue doesn't like when you use has own property, but also React, I think
Don't do that.
Can you maybe explain why that would be the case, on why certain ones don't work in circumstances?
Well, the objects aren't real objects; they're magic objects. And as for how I would test that with Lodash. Cool. Any other questions about this? I'm like 15 minutes late for the other one.
Sorry.
thanks, Kyle. Thank you for showing us your black magic sorcery.
Awesome. Cheers, homies.